So the first thing we're going to do today is tape down our watercolor paper using masking tape. It's very important that you de-stick it a little bit on your clothes so it doesn't rip your paper when you go to take it off. Make sure that you tape down all 4 sides. If you open your palette to find dirty paint, you can easily fix that by getting some clean water on a brush and gently rubbing it across the surface, rinsing and repeating until the paint is back to normal. So I'm going to paint a landscape using some basic watercolor techniques, and I'm going to start with the sky, and I'm going to show you a technique called a graded wash. Before I can begin, I need to mix up my paint, so I take some clean water into my brush and gently mix it into my paint, and I drag it over to my well until I have a nice puddle of color. I can mix multiple colors together. Once I've mixed enough paint in my palette, I can begin my graded wash. I rinse my brush and gently blot on a paper towel so it doesn't have too much water. I'm using a flat brush and I'm going to fill it with the paint we just mixed. I can scrape my brush or blot on a paper towel to make sure there's not too much paint. A graded wash begins with an even back and forth stroke across the paper. I need to overlap each stroke so that the color stays even and smooth. Once I've painted several strokes with the dark blue, I'm going to rinse some of the color out of my brush and continue to paint back and forth, allowing the color to start to change from dark to light. Before my paint dries, I can use a paper towel to blot up some of the color. This is great for clouds. Allow your paper to dry. Next up, I'm going to create a distant mountain range using another graded wash. Just remember that things that are far away are always lighter in value, so mix whatever color you want, just make sure it's not too dark. You don't have to do mountains, you could also do sand dunes or hills or even the ocean. Before my paper has a chance to dry, I'm going to do a technique called wet in wet. I'm going to create some distant kind of soft bushes with some concentrated green and blue, and notice how the color just kind of bleeds into the paper. This technique is great for bushes or soft foliage, but remember you don't have much control. For this technique, I need my paper to be completely dry first. I'm going to be painting some pine trees, and they're in the middle ground, so they should be darker and more vibrant in color than my mountains and background trees. So using the concentrated paint in my brush, I'm essentially just drawing trees right over my dried background painting. This is called wet on dry. Notice that the paint stays where I put it, unlike with the wet on wet. When I get to the bottom of this section, I can soften the edges using a little bit of water. If you wish, you can add another layer of bushes, trees, or even a lake. Now that my previous layers are dry, I'm going to do a variation on a graded wash called a variegated wash. The goal of this technique is to create a nice gradient from one color to a second color. The foreground of my painting is a field, so I'm painting from yellow to green. While I'm waiting for my paper to dry, I'm going to go back into my mountains and add some snow-capped peaks. With a little water on my brush, I paint back over the areas that I want to lift off the color. I can use a paper towel to help blot up the extra color. For the final part of my landscape, I'm going to use a technique called dry brush. I need to remove as much water from my brush as I can and separate the bristles. Next, I dip the brush into some concentrated paint, and when I start to brush across the surface, you'll be able to see the individual brush strokes. This technique is great for creating grass and twigs and branches and flowers in your foreground. Don't forget that elements in a landscape that are closest to you are darker and more colorful, so don't be afraid to make your paint a little more concentrated. You'll also be able to see more detail in the foreground, and the dry brush technique is great for adding flowers, branches, and stems. Remove the masking tape and you're done!